Great. Thank you very much, Catherine. And I'm always a little bit, kind of humbled by when these introductions, and I really should shorten my introduction. But what my introduction doesn't say is, it talks about me having started some social enterprises and co-ops. It talks about my current, should be a little higher, sorry. My current university academia, accomplishments. But what it doesn't say is that I'm actually a business person. I started, in business after graduating from university. Went back to university and took an MBA. Then I came out in the 70s with a freshly minted MBA from Schulich in York University in Toronto. And, I was ready to set the world on fire. Back then, in the 70s, an MBA didn't matter which university you went to, it was very, very traditional. It was all about learning business skills and then, going out making a profit. If you're going to work in the corporate sector, it's all about maximizing the bottom line for your shareholders, financial bottom line for your shareholders. And that's what I came out with, and ended up working at a multinational corporation called Noranda. At that time, Noranda was all one corporate conglomerate, both in exploration, mining, and forest products. Biggest, it owned Macmillan Bloedel while I was working there, so it was huge. And I was working, because my undergraduate degree is in forestry, I was working in the forest products arm of Noranda. And because I was, had some business experience, had this new MBA, I got promoted very quickly from managing marketing manager to international sales to eventually, a few years later, being in charge of corporate planning for Noranda. And it's in that capacity as a corporate planner that I kind of had my midlife crisis very early in my life. In corporate planning, in a large multinational corporation, you're moving resources around the globe. It's all about maximizing shareholder return, and I was closing down factories, and I take some personal responsibility. Noranda was closing factories in Canada and opening up new factories in the United States and South America and Europe. And after I take responsibility for closing down Chatham, New Brunswick, the waferboard plant in Chatham back in the early 80s. And that was about 125 workers that was devastated the whole community because that was the largest employer in Chatham, New Brunswick. And just threw the entire community into chaos, as it does in any small community that's dependent on one large factory or manufacturing plant. And that was the beginning of the end. I said, I cannot do this anymore. The corporate culture started to question my commitment to the corporation because I was questioning too much about values and the activities. So I just sat out for a year waiting to be fired because I wasn't going to quit. Did absolutely nothing for a year. Sat in a corner office on Bay Street near, right in downtown, the financial district of Toronto, and waited for something to happen because I felt, they couldn't really fire me because I hadn't done anything wrong. My personal values were no longer in sync with the corporate values. So eventually they did fire me, and that was like, went home and celebrated with a bottle of champagne with my partner because that was just what I, just felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. And during that last year, I ended up trying to deal with my conscience about having closed Chatham and other closures elsewhere, that I started helping a factory in Hamilton called Canadian Porcelain, which had been put into receivership because even though it was profitable, it wasn't profitable enough for the owners, and they put it into receivership so it could be sold off. The employees approached me and see if they needed help to actually buy the plant from the receiver. So I took up, I thought this was a wonderful opportunity to redeem myself, and took up the challenge, and we prepared a business plan. We got the financing in place, went to the Royal Bank, who was the receiver, with the plan, with the financing in place, put in an offer, and they wouldn't even accept the offer from the employees, from the management and employees team. Basically, they said, we have an offer from a competitor in the United States who was also in porcelain, porcelain manufacturers, by the way. They made these on all utility poles across the world. It's the porcelain insulators that sit on top of the utility poles. And this is the latest, or the last Canadian producer of porcelain insulators. So if they didn't take our offer, we marched on the Royal Bank Venture, by the way. CBC Venture, that for some of you old enough to know, was a CBC show, documentary. They filmed the whole process and put on a half-hour. In the archives, in the Venture archives, there's actually a half-hour documentary on the attempted buyout of Canadian Porcelain. So it failed. The workers were devastated. We met with Mr. Sinclair, who was the minister in charge of FIRA, the Foreign Investment Review Agency. They approved. That was the last review that was done before FIRA was unassembled. And we told them what's going to happen is the foreign competitor is going to buy it, use the sales list, like the customer list, shut down the factory and supply it from the United States. Within a year, the plant was closed, and exactly what we had said, forecasted, had happened. So this was my kind of, my aha moment, and propelled me into the social economy. Catherine mentioned some of the early beginnings of Away Express, which it's now 28 years since it was started. In the mental health clients in Toronto, who we set up a courier business using the public transportation system to get around, because it's just the traffic is so hectic in Toronto that bicycling or driving cars would be difficult for people with mental health issues, but they could actually manage walking and using the public transportation. It's been a very, very successful social enterprise and been still ongoing. And in the mental health community, it's been used as an example of what you can do as an enterprise with people with mental health issues. So there's actually, for those of you in the audience who are fortunate enough to be in the MBA program and have had to buy my book as part of the course material, you'll notice there's a chapter actually in that book about how does somebody get from being a multinational corporate executive into the north end of Winnipeg, working in the social economy. So I didn't want to put that chapter in, but the publisher of the book really felt that story was interesting and would add to the book about inner city renovation. So for those of you who've read it, you knew everything I just said. And if you haven't, there's a whole chapter going into more detail. So the other part of this that needs to be told is how do I get to, from Bay Street in Toronto to the north end of Winnipeg, is that I met my current wife who was just finishing with a PhD in Toronto, and she got a tenure-track job at the University of Manitoba, so we moved to Winnipeg and said, well, we'll try it. If we don't like it, we can always move elsewhere, and that was 23 years ago. So 23 years in Winnipeg, and we're just loving it. And by the way, to our previous speakers about breastfeeding, both our children were breastfed. Of course, I was breastfed because back when I was born, there was no, I don't think formula had been invented yet, right? And in Europe, where I was born, it was just the norm. So, so the big thing that most of you know is that the current economy is not sustainable. Right? the high unemployment rates, the revolving financial crisis, the last one that we had in 2009, the chaos that kind of impacts, the fact that our global warming and environmental degradation, and the growing gap between the rich and poor. All those things are indications that our current economy is not sustainable. When I was in India earlier this year, accepting that talent, that's only people in India who talk in those kind of superlatives, the most talented social innovator. But I met Mr. Pagan, who wrote this book called Corporation 2020. And when I teach my sustainability course now, I make that book mandatory reading for MBA students, because it just really goes into the fact, into the details of why our current economy is not sustainable. You know that students now in business schools are quite aware of that fact. And the social enterprise course that I teach at University of Winnipeg, every year it's full, 50 students, that's the max. And there's a waiting list of 20, 30 students every year. And, it's amazing that some of them take it because it's the time slot fits their schedule. But I think for many of them, it's really their genuine interest in social enterprise, or incorporating a social mission into a business activity. So the Green Economy Initiative of the United Nations actually says that not only is it possible to have social equity and economic development mixed together, it's essential, it's imperative. So that's good to know. So I guess I can't step away from this, then you won't hear me. I'll just lean into the mic. So I'm going to talk about kind of the north end of Winnipeg now, where I spent the last 23 years of my life. Most of you would be familiar with this because it's not unique to Winnipeg. There was a derelict housing, a lot of boarded up. Some of the main streets in the north end, the shopping center, which used to be a destination for Winnipeggers to go shopping, pretty much all closed down by 2000 or late 1990s. Boarded up housing, poverty was rampant, a high Aboriginal population. There are rival Aboriginal gangs in the community, safety issues. A lot of, once poverty has taken place, or the impact of poverty are just devastating to a community. So the north end of Winnipeg was one of those communities that, along with downtown East Side Vancouver, would kind of rival each other for being potentially the most what the adjective I want to use, but some of the most challenging communities to live in Canada. And I think there's some similarities probably with the devastation that's happened here with all the closures some years ago in the steel and in the coal industry. So just an example of a boarded up house in the north end. And you can see the Aboriginal gang slogans that are on the side of the building, which the tags. So how did Inner City get started? Originally, when I first arrived in Winnipeg, I became vice president of investment for a labor-sponsored fund that had just been created in Winnipeg, in Manitoba. It was called the Crocus Fund in Manitoba. And it had a lot of social ambitions, social goals that could not be implemented in the fund itself, because people were investing their money for their returns in their old age, right? Their kind of pensions and that. So, but we had a real social initiative in the people who ran Crocus and the Manitoba Federation of Labor, who basically was the sponsor of this investment fund. And so we started a kind of a dialogue. We invited about a dozen people from across North America to come to Winnipeg and help us kind of figure out what can we best do to alleviate poverty in the inner city, in the north end of Winnipeg. And I mentioned this to some people earlier today in my discussions, but Rankin McSween was one of those 12 people that we invited and who came to Winnipeg 2 or 3 times in what ended up being the charity Community Ownership Solutions, which then developed Inner City Renovation. So Rankin McSween, from New Dawn here in Sydney, played a role in the startup of what is now Inner City Renovation. So the niche that we developed in terms of the many community groups in a challenging community address poverty issues. We felt that the best way we could address poverty is by creating social enterprises that create employment for people who are unemployed. And not just people unemployed, but basically people who couldn't get employment because of criminal records, because of addictions, any of the challenges that keep people out of the traditional workforce. And the board that we set up for Community Ownership Solutions basically got very high-profile people in Winnipeg, both from the labor movement, from the corporate world, from academia, from Aboriginal and other community organizations. There were about 12 board members, and people that everybody in Winnipeg would actually know by name. Lloyd Axworthy who was the Chancellor, President of the University of Winnipeg after he resigned from his cabinet post in the Liberal government. He was in charge of foreign affairs in the Chrétien government. He was on our board of the charity. Aboriginal leaders were on the board. Paul Moist, who is now the national president of CUPE, in the labor movement, was on our board. So a very high-profile board, which, if you're contemplating doing something like this, having that kind of a board with community involvement from all factions would be, a good idea. Okay, so Community Ownership Solutions did a number of feasibility, became the general manager. I was seconded, by the way, from the Crocus Fund, from the labor-sponsored fund, to start up the charity called Community Ownership Solutions. So in that role, I looked at all the possible ideas for a startup of a social enterprise. And what we wanted to do was make sure that whatever social enterprise we started, we wanted to make sure that we can pay fair wages and benefits, and that we can train people in some sort of profession or trade that they could use to their benefit for the rest of their lives. And after looking at a number of possibilities, we came up with the construction sector, the renovation construction sector, as meeting most of the criteria that we were looking for. So in 2002, in August, we incorporated Inner City Renovation. And we incorporated it as a for-profit share capital corporation. So no different than any other for-profit company. Same kind of share structure as General Motors or any large corporation. The only difference was that the shares are all owned by non-profit charities. So when I developed the business plan, I wanted buy-in from the community, and went to 4 non-profit housing groups in different communities in the city and said, here's an opportunity for you to participate in this enterprise. You could be a shareholder in the enterprise. It won't cost you any money, but you need to commit 50% of your future construction renovation needs to the new company. And the 4 non-profit housing groups, all their boards bought into the idea, and they became shareholders. We set up a memorandum of understanding that they would be responsible, or that they had a commitment to put 50% of their work, their future work, give that to the company that we were now jointly shareholders in. At about the same time, I became aware of a business plan competition in Toronto by Social Capital Partners, the Bill Young family, who had just gotten interest in, well, Bill would say that a ship came home. His family sold Red Hat computers, which was a high-tech industry sector, and they sold it. And he would say that the ship came home, and he ended up setting up a foundation and then Social Capital Partners to support kind of social enterprise development in marginalized communities. Turns out that over 120 business plans were submitted from coast to coast to coast, and that the business plan for inner city renovation won the competition, which had a $15,000 cash prize and up to $1 million worth of financing. So this is like winning the lottery ticket, right? I mean, this is almost unheard of. How many, so very, very fortunate to get that kind of support. And then Social Capital Partners became the 6th nonprofit shareholder in inner city renovation. So when we started up, we had six nonprofit shareholders, all equal, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6 each. And before we started up, because of that commitment from our 4 housing developers, we had potentially over $1 million worth of revenue in the first year before we even started up. And so the whole idea would be, especially in the first few years, would be social housing for our shareholders. And that's what we did for the first year or so. And then we got sidetracked. And this is a hard lesson to learn, but it was tempting. There was a lot of commercial renewal happening in the North End. And there was an old Woolworths, closed-up Woolworths store on Selkirk Avenue in the North End that the Urban Circle Training Center, an Aboriginal education center, wanted to purchase and renovate and set up a training school for Aboriginal youth. And we ended up being interested in entering the commercial sector, and we actually entered a fixed price contract to renovate that Woolworth building into what you see on the screen, an Aboriginal training center. And the caution is that, make sure you can walk before you run. We lost $200,000 on that one project, which would be enough to, have shuttled the whole business if it wasn't for some of the financial supporters that I had, including the Social Capital Partners in Toronto. But because we finished the project on time, everybody was happy with the quality, with our work. It became a kind of a poster project that we can promote our services in the future, saying we built this building, this is what we can do. And it's amazing that when you take I kind of described the people we were hiring. Now we also had to have journey carpenters, of course, to train them and supervise them. But when you think we have this kind of ragtag group of individuals who within 2 years of being hired by Inner City Renovation can do a project like Urban Circle Training Center. It's amazing what people can do if you give them the resources, the support, and trust that, that they need to do the job. So the following year, or within a year after that, Assiniboine Credit Union had been our financial institution where we banked and where we had a line of credit. And they were very supportive. They have a very social-minded board and a community-minded board. And we ended up building new branches for Assiniboine Credit Union. So this was our first new branch that we built in the Main Street North. Again, when you think of the complexity, right, of huge, glue laminated beams, it's a wood structure, but it's a very, challenging. It's not just a box; it's actually a beautiful building. And you see the bottom right-hand corner there, the finished product, and a view of the inside when it was finished. So we built 2 of these, and then in subsequent years we did a couple more renovations for them of existing financial institutions. Did I just skip one? Oh. Sometimes it goes too fast and sometimes it doesn't go at all. So the other thing we started doing after renovations was building new infill housing in the inner city, vacant lots or houses that had been needed demolishing because they're too derelict, and we started building new housing. There was an affordable housing initiative that had tripartite funding from 3 levels of government that was funding the development of these infill houses. I think we ended up building about 30 of them over a period of years. About 1,000 square feet, 2-story, 3-bedroom. We were building these for about $100,000 each, not including the land, just the building itself. The reason that's a brand new house, the reason it's boarded up is that you don't take the boards off until the day people move in, because the windows would not, they're built in communities where there's a lot of chaos and violence, and we had trouble building these homes. You put in copper piping, and the next morning you'd come in, and the copper piping that you just installed the day before had already been removed, just for the scrap price, right? So we kept them boarded up until people moved in, and then we came and took the boards down. Oops, I skipped another one. So this is the Mountain Equipment Co-op store in Winnipeg, and it was the first LEED certified structure in Manitoba, in Winnipeg and in Manitoba. There's considerably more now, but this is in the 2006, 2007. We didn't do the whole building. We did the 3rd floor of that building, which now houses about 6, 7 environmental groups. But it's also done to the LEED standards. And this is a heritage historic building, the Dominion Bank. It doesn't exist anymore, but it's a historic building in Winnipeg. It was bought by an architectural firm called the Bridgman Collaborative. We formed a relationship with them and ended up renovating this bank building for their own architectural firm. But also, we ended up in a relationship with them where we were their kind of go-to contractor for a lot of the projects that they designed. So again, building relationships with specifiers, architects, other subcontractors is really important to our progress. So what impacts? And my main reason for writing the book was to really document the impacts that Inner City Renovation had on the employees, the workers, the community, and to society in general. So some of the impacts on the individuals. First and foremost is the self-respect, the respect, the dignity, and self-esteem that having people work, getting a wage, bringing a wage home, supporting their families, and not only that, they can actually, because in construction, you can actually take your kids or your family members or extended family out and say, I built that building or I built that house. So it's actually something that you can show visibly to people and be proud of. So self-esteem, dignity, and respect. We paid either average or better than average wages to all our workers. So our minimum, our lowest paid worker who had no training whatsoever from the time that he or she started, and so this is now going now back to 2007 or 2008, we would be paying them $14 an hour, well above minimum wage, because we realized that minimum wage is not a living wage. So we wanted to make sure that we were paying people a living wage. In the Aboriginal community, one wage earner could be supporting 10 or more dependents, right? Not just children, but other family members. And so even a living wage doesn't go very far if you're supporting a large large number of dependents. The other thing we did from day one is we set up a health benefit plan for every employee. So drugs and dental and life insurance. Unheard of in the construction industry, in particular in a small construction company. And for for probably all our workers, the first time in their lives that they actually had a benefit plan, a drug benefit plan. We made sure that they had opportunities for career advancement. We helped them get housing. You cannot have employees be successful or be working if they don't have a home to go to at night, right? They need to be able to have a bed to sleep in at night. So we made sure that everybody was housed properly, that they had a certain amount of nutrition. And we provided a lot of social supports for both the workers and their families. Picnics for the kids and families, outings to ball games and hockey games. Once a year, a retreat with the whole family, all their kids, to a retreat center out of the city. And we were provided every employee with the opportunity to enter the professional apprenticeship program, the provincial apprenticeship program, to get their credentials, whether it would be a level 1, 2, 3, or 4, or all the way to become a journey person. And we had a number of people who went through the whole program and became from level 1 to becoming a journeyman carpenter. And we also provided life skills courses to people, because how to manage your money. We very quickly got everybody bank accounts at the credit union, because when we were paying by check, they would go to check cashing places and spend a large part of their just to check their cash their check. They would be spending significant amount of money, and then they were tempted to cash it before payday, and they would be paying even larger amounts of money. So we stopped that, got them all bank accounts, deposited the money right into their accounts, and so that was I think a good thing. But the thing I'm most proud of in some of our supports that we provided was the getting the kids out of institutional care. A number of our employees had lost their kids because they didn't have proper housing or they couldn't care for their children. So Children's Family Services take their children into care. Once they actually had a home and had income and work, they could apply to get their children back out of care. And that, there were several of our workers were able to do that, and that was one, I think, of all the accomplishments that we were able to provide for our employees. That was one of the ones that I think was most, well, certainly the most emotional. So in terms of the community, because of the, the community, the immediate community in the inner city and the North End was in such disarray and dilapidation, we were a big part of the renewal, both in terms of residential housing, where we would build and renovate houses on blocks. So it wasn't just one house here, one house there. We wanted to make an impact, and then we would do 5 or 6 houses on one block. Just to you need that kind of nucleus to generate kind of renewal. We were part of regenerating the commercial areas by all the commercial projects we did. So we increased safety. When you live in a community with boarded up stores and boarded up houses, it's not safe to walk down the street, right? Because people can't see you. But once you have storefronts with glass and homes that are actually not boarded up, and people living in them, the entire community becomes a much safer community. And it's a kind of 101 of community economic development. Because these workers all lived in the community, the wages that they earned are spent in the community. They don't leave the community. So they're not foreign workers. They're not workers that come to the inner city and then go back to their suburbs. They're actually spending the money in the inner city. So those are all benefits to the community. And again, you can expand on each of them. And in terms of impacts on society, a couple of things. One is it creates a more egalitarian society. You probably know that in our current economy, the ratio of the lowest paid worker to the highest paid worker in any particular company is, in a large company, it's about 300 or 400 to 1, so that the CEO or the president would make 300-400 times as much money as the lowest paid worker in that company. At Inner City Renovation, it was 2.5 times to 1. So as the general manager, my salary, because it's a social enterprise owned by charities, my salary was 2.5 times the lowest paid worker. Right? So it creates a much more egalitarian society where, and reducing the gap between the rich and poor. About between 60 and 70% of our employees were Aboriginal. So it really created it really created an opportunity for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people to get to know each other because they're working together. Their safety depends on working cooperatively. So that was a big benefit. And for government finances, there's a whole chapter in the book about different scenarios, but it's a win-win situation for government. When you think of it cost over $100,000 to keep a person incarcerated for a year, in terms of if they're on social assistance, the costs to government are significant, and when people become employed, they're actually making a contribution. They're paying taxes both on their purchases and on income tax to the government. So it's a complete reversal, and it's a win-win situation for everybody. Okay, what I want to do with the remaining time, I'm almost at the end. I want you to see an 8-minute DVD video that we have queued up, which is basically the employees, the workers, talking about the impacts that the company had on their lives, which I think is quite moving. So. Good. I think I was there. How do we queue up? Yep. Have you got it back there? By the way, I'm sorry for looking this way, because if I look that way, I can't see anything. Okay.
I know we have the video. There is a little bit more time for you to talk as well, but I just want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions because I'm sure it's
Sure.
going to be a lot.
Well, why don't we look at the video,
Yeah, great.
and I'll talk a little bit about that last slide as to why it's all of a sudden, social enterprise has become the buzzword and so popular. Okay, well, there, you have it right. By the way, I never mentioned we hired a social worker, Larry Morissette, because we found out very quickly that working with the challenges that our employees were dealing with and trying to build the buildings we were building were we're not meshing with each other. So Larry became our social worker on staff for about 5 years to provide supports to our employees. And of course, we've turned out to be, well, I shouldn't say of course, but we've become very, very close, good friends even though we've both left ICR some years ago. But what I was going to say before we get to questions about that last slide I skipped over is to why are social enterprises now all of a sudden kind of so important, right? So prominent. Partially, it's because it's the name. It's kind of a buzzword, right? I mean, there are many organizations that have had nonprofit organizations that have earned revenue strategies for decades, but they never called it a social enterprise. So now people are, even organizations like Imaginability in Toronto that deals with people with intellectual challenges, they've been in business for 54 years with providing employment and having an earned revenue strategy. And it's only in the last, kind of 5 or so or less than 10 years that they started referring to themselves as a social enterprise. And there's many examples like that. The other main big reason is that with the financial crisis in 2009 in the economy, there were many cutbacks to not-for-profit organizations not only from government, but also from foundations and other United Way. So it's now, organizations don't really want to cut back their services and their staffing in relationship to cutbacks in funding, so they try to make up those cutbacks with introducing an earned revenue strategy or a social enterprise. And then a third reason is that social enterprises offer nonprofit organizations that have a certain mission, say to provide employment or provide training or things for the clients, that this is actually meets their goals, right? It's kind of meshes with their social goals. So, and then another fourth reason, say, is that the for-profit sector will only provide products and services on which they can make a profit. There are certain things that that our society and our communities need that the private sector will not provide because the profit isn't large enough. So non-profit organizations can offer these services and products because as long as they can break even, they can manage quite well. They don't have to return and then a shareholder returns to the shareholder. So many reasons for the popularity. And of course, there's a number of successful social enterprises now, coast to coast to coast, and that also feeds the frenzy as to me too. I'd like to do this as well. Other people have done it successfully. So those are some of the reasons why it's so popular. So I'm happy to answer any questions that either was things I've said or things that were in the video that okay, well, I've met with okay, go ahead.
Hello. Okay. Thanks, Marty. My name's Chloe, and I'm from the North End, Winnipeg, so that was neat to hear your presentation. Yeah. But I had a question around the Build Social Enterprise and ICR, because it seems like you're both operating in North End, Winnipeg, doing housing renovation work with similar employees, but Build had really strong support, and it seems like now it's so it's so much like a smaller scale of what they're able to accomplish, whereas ICR seem to be able to have a model that's been able to sustain itself, at least from an outside perspective. So I'm curious about your opinion about what was different about those two approaches.
Right. Build, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a social enterprise in the North End that does mainly insulation upgrades and water reduction upgrades. And it's mainly a training program for young mainly Aboriginal people, both men and women. So they provide a lot of training. Most of the employees at Build rotate, and they're there for 6 months, and then they move on. We at ICR took a number of Build graduates, and they started to work at ICR. So ICR did much more complicated. We were able to have journeyman carpenters become journeyman carpenters because of the kind of work we did and the training we did, whereas Build is much more of an introduction to certain simpler tasks. Very important, very necessary, but yeah. It's great that you have a mic that.
Hi, my name is Janet Robinson. I'm with a group that does helps women get into trades and technology. So this is really exciting stuff, considering that we have housing issues here, and I hear about those housing issues all the time. And I had actually a couple of questions. One was related to how did it come to be that you went into a derelict building and rebuilt it? Like, who owned that building? Was that building owned by the city? Was there an owner? And the other question with that is, ICR sounds like it's very successful. How do they relate with profit renovation businesses in that community?
What was the one word? How did they compare to?
Yeah, how do they relate? How
relate?
Because
Okay.
we live in a very union environment. I think Victor sang a song about his dad who was very strong union. So I wonder about, and that's almost a third question.
Right.
Because you have, I guess, the competition. What
Sure.
was the impact of that competition?
Okay. In terms of competition, first of all, people didn't necessarily know we were a social enterprise, right? One of the things we found out very quickly is that we don't need to tell people that we're a social enterprise because it creates negative stereotypes. So for a lot of our competitors that we were competing with, other contractors, they would not necessarily know that we were owned by 6 charities. Right? I mean, if somebody took the trouble to find out, they could, but by just looking at us, they wouldn't necessarily know. And even people who were hiring us wouldn't necessarily know. Most of the first 2 years was all social housing for our shareholders, right? The nonprofit agencies. Once we started doing commercial work, it was almost always for nonprofit groups that owned properties or were buying properties that would hire us, probably because of a social commitment. And then once we started getting into relationships with architects and other contractors, we started actually doing things that were in the private sector that were totally unrelated to nonprofit organizations. And I was telling somebody earlier today that the gross margins on different kinds of work, general contractors would not come into the North End because the margins were not high enough, and safety issues, right? Perceived safety issues for their workers and for theft of their materials. They just would avoid, why come to the inner city and work for 5% profit margin when they could be working in the suburbs for 30, 40% profit margin with no other hassles or safety issues. So that's some of the realities of. There was one other part of your question.
Well, I just wonder about, because I remember attending a session here. we have housing issues, you know, rents that are outrageous for substandard housing. And so, but I get the housing initiatives that you did renovations on were for housing groups.
Right.
That's where those
Yes.
houses came from.
Yep.
I'd forgotten that
Yep.
piece. I was just wondering, that was the other part of it.
Okay. Eventually, we started doing housing renovations and additions in the private sector, because the gross margins were much higher, and then we can use some of that profit to support our work in the inner city on social housing. So, I can answer one question that is on some people's mind that I've been asked 4 times already about the realities of Cape Breton and Sydney and unions in the construction sector. You mentioned unions in your question? Okay. So in Manitoba, it was not an issue. As I mentioned, we had Paul Moist, who was the president of the largest labor union in Canada, on our board of directors. So we had a relationship with the labor movement right from early going. And the labor movement is much more, in most areas, much more progressive than the narrow view of, just work for their members, right? They try to be progressive about all kinds of social issues in the community, creating jobs for people, daycares, what have you, right? They're committed to that. So if you can get them involved at early stage, knowing that this is for improving the community and we're all working together to improve the community, then I think you can, and it's not to say that the social enterprise couldn't be unionized at some point. If for in Wolfville, Just Us Coffee Roasters Co-op, which many people would argue is a social enterprise because of their social mission, even though it's a worker cooperative, just unionized this past year, right? So I don't know how many of you knew that, but it's new. There's a book written on it by Fernwood Publishing that documents their transition to a unionized cooperative.